Hello friends and family, today topic is all the stores had no food left and the only thing that was left was pet food, which people were starting to eat. I was shocked. Let's begin. You're not gonna believe what happened at the supermarket, Mark said, his eyes wide with disbelief. He tossed his empty shopping basket aside and leaned against the kitchen counter. What now? Linda replied, not looking up from her phone. She had heard a dozen similar stories in the last few weeks. Mark took a deep breath and began. Everything, absolutely everything was gone. Not a single can of beans or a loaf of bread left. It's like someone hit the panic button and emptied the whole place out. Linda finally glanced up, the concern in his voice piercing through her digital bubble. What are you saying? Did they have any idea when they're getting more supplies? Mark shook his head, his expression grim. No word at all. The cashiers looked just as clueless as we did. And the worst part, he paused, swallowing hard, people have started to eat the pet food. Linda's eyes shot open, a mix of horror and disbelief. What? You can't be serious. I wish I weren't, Mark said, running a hand through his hair. I saw a guy with a cart full of kibble. Said he had a recipe for emergency beef and rice. Can you imagine? The room fell silent as the gravity of the situation settled over them. The fridge was almost bare. Their pantry echoed with emptiness. Linda's stomach rumbled, a cruel reminder of their plight. She put her phone down and walked over to Mark, wrapping her arms around him. Mark returns from the supermarket with shocking news. The shelves are bare, and people have resorted to buying and eating pet food. Linda is initially unfazed until Mark's description of a man with a cart full of kibble and a disturbing recipe breaks through her nonchalance. The reality of their food crisis becomes palpable as they stand in their nearly empty kitchen. We'll figure this out, she whispered, trying to inject hope into the room. But the doubt in his eyes mirrored her own fears. The news reports had been grim, talking about supply shortages and chaos in distant cities. Now, it had come knocking on their own door. They decided to visit their neighbors, hoping someone had stockpiled something they hadn't thought of. Knocking on doors, they met the same look of desperation on each face. Mrs. Jenkins, usually so cheerful, looked haggard and tired. She held a can of dog food in her hand, her eyes avoiding theirs as she mumbled something about her grandkids being picky eaters. As the day progressed, the reality of their situation sank in. The local diner had closed its doors, unable to serve anything but water. The gas station had no gas. The usually bustling streets of their small town were eerily quiet, with only the occasional car passing by, searching for a place that might have something to offer. Mark and Linda returned home with their neighbor's reluctant gift of a half-empty bag of kibble. They stared at it on the kitchen table, the plastic reflecting the flickering light from the candles they had lit to conserve energy. The silence between them grew heavier than the air outside. We can't do this, Linda murmured, her voice trembling. We can't survive on this. Mark squeezed her hand tightly. We don't have much of a choice, do we? Mark and Linda, desperate for food, visit their neighbors and find the same desperation they felt at the supermarket. They encounter Mrs. Jenkins, who offers them dog food out of embarrassment. The town's diner and gas station have closed, and the streets are quiet. They return home with a bag of kibble, symbolizing their desolate situation and the stark choices ahead. They sat down at the kitchen table, the bag of kibble a stark reminder of their dwindling options. Mark's eyes searched the room, as if hoping a solution might materialize from the shadows. We need a plan, he said, his voice firm but strained. We can't just sit here and wait for things to get better. We need to find food, or at least a way to get some. Linda nodded, her eyes red from unshed tears. She pulled her hand away from his and stood up, walking over to the window to peer outside. The setting sun painted the sky with a mournful shade of red. "What if we go to the farms on the outskirts of town?" she suggested. "Maybe they have something they haven't had a chance to bring to market." Mark considered her idea, his eyes lighting up with a spark of hope. "It's worth a shot," he said, pushing back his chair. "We've got nothing to lose." They packed a small backpack with what little they had, a few bottles of water, a flashlight, and a can opener. The sun had dipped below the horizon by the time they set off, the chilly evening air a stark contrast to the warmth of their house. The streets were now completely deserted, the only sound the occasional distant howl of a dog, which sent shivers down Linda's spine. The farm was about a 2-mile walk, and as they approached, the smell of earth and animals grew stronger. The darkness was thick, with only the moon casting a silvery glow on the path ahead. When they arrived, the farm looked abandoned. The barn doors were ajar, and there was no light coming from the house. They tiptoed closer, their hearts pounding in their chests. The silence was broken only by the distant sound of a coyote's call. Mark whispered a prayer that they wouldn't encounter any wild animals desperate for food themselves. They peeked into the barn, and to their relief, it was filled with sacks of grain and a few live chickens clucking nervously in the corner. "Jackpot," Mark breathed, his eyes scanning the room for anything they could use. They moved cautiously, not wanting to startle the chickens or alert any potential predators. Linda's grip on the flashlight was tight as they approached the sacks of grain. Mark whispered, "We can't take too much. We need to be fair to the animals and leave something for the farmers if they come back." Linda nodded, her eyes searching for anything else that might be edible. The beam of the flashlight danced across the floor, and she spotted something shiny in the corner. "Look," she whispered, pointing to a metal bucket. They tiptoed over and found it half filled with a mixture of grains and seeds. It was definitely meant for the chickens, but it looked like it could be a meal for them too. They quickly filled their backpack with as much as they could carry, trying to be as quiet as possible. The chickens had settled down, watching them with curious eyes. As they turned to leave, a soft creaking sound from the barn door sent a jolt of fear through Linda. She froze, the flashlight trembling in her hand. Mark put a finger to his lips, his eyes darting to the door. They waited, holding their breath. The creaking stopped, and the only sound was the wind outside. Slowly, they began to relax. Linda whispered, "Let's go," and they headed for the house, hoping for more luck. The house was dark and quiet. They approached the kitchen window, the glass foggy with condensation. Carefully, Mark peeked inside. The sight that met them was both surprising and alarming. The kitchen was well stocked with canned goods, jars of preserves, and loaves of bread. It was clear that the farmers had been preparing for a situation like this. But the room was also in disarray, with cabinets open and items scattered across the floor. It was as if someone had been searching through it in a hurry, or had been interrupted. Linda's eyes grew wide with hope as she pointed to a row of canned vegetables on the counter. "Look, Mark, we can eat." They exchanged a look, weighing the risks. The house felt empty, but they knew they couldn't be sure. Mark gently turned the doorknob, and it gave way with a quiet click. They stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under their weight. The room was warm, and the smell of recent cooking lingered in the air, making their stomachs growl even louder. They found the source of the mess in the pantry. Cans and jars were strewn across the floor, A few cracked open. Mark picked up a jar of homemade strawberry jam, the sticky contents seeping through his fingers. "Someone was here," he murmured. Linda's eyes searched the room, landing on a half-eaten sandwich on the counter. "Or something," she said, her voice a barely audible whisper. The bread was stale, but the sandwich was mostly untouched. A chill ran down her spine. They gathered what they could, without making too much noise, their hearts racing at the thought of being caught. They found a bag of flour, a few eggs, and a small chunk of cheese. It wasn't much, but it was something. As they turned to leave, a floorboard creaked loudly beneath them. They both froze, holding their breaths. A shadow moved in the hallway, and a figure emerged into the moonlit kitchen. It was Old Man Jenkins, their neighbor, his eyes wild and desperate. He held a hunting knife in one hand, his other hand clutching a half-eaten apple. The sight of him sent a wave of shock and fear through Linda. "Please," Mark said, holding up his hands, "we just need food. We're not here to harm you." Old Man Jenkins's eyes narrowed, the knife still pointed at them. "What are you doing in my house?" His voice was hoarse, edged with suspicion. Linda took a step back, her heart pounding. "We're sorry," she managed to say. "The supermarket's out of food. We saw the lights and thought maybe you had something to spare." Old Man Jenkins looked at them for a long moment, the knife still in his hand. Then, with a heavy sigh, he lowered it. "Everyone's desperate," he said, his eyes sad. "But you can't just come into someone's home and take what you want." Mark stepped forward, his voice calm. "We understand, Mr. Jenkins. We didn't mean to scare you. We're just trying to survive." The old man studied them for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a slow nod, he said, "I get it. I've seen things out there that make this look like a picnic." He waved the knife towards the door. "But you can't stay here. It's not safe." They didn't argue. They knew they had to leave, but the sight of the food was like a mirage in the desert. Mark took Linda's hand and led her back out into the night, their meager supplies feeling heavier with each step. They didn't dare speak until they were well away from the house, their breaths coming in short gasps. "What do we do now?" Linda whispered, her voice trembling. Mark's grip on her hand tightened. "We keep moving. Maybe there's another farm we can try." They hurried away from the Jenkins farm, the adrenaline of the encounter propelling them forward. The moon was their only guide, casting long, eerie shadows across the fields. The cold wind nipped at their faces, carrying with it the scent of frost and desperation. As they approached the next farm, the silhouette of a barn loomed in the distance. The windows of the house were dark, and the only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant howl of a lonely wolf. Mark and Linda approached the barn, their eyes scanning for any signs of life. "Maybe we'll have better luck here," Mark whispered, hope etched into his voice. The barn door creaked open, and the scent of hay and livestock greeted them. They stepped inside, their flashlight beam sweeping over the dusty floor and the rows of empty stalls. There was a soft whinny, and they saw a horse in the far corner, its eyes gleaming in the light. The animal seemed healthy, thankfully, but there was no sign of anyone else. They moved through the barn, their footsteps echoing in the vast space. Mark's mind raced with scenarios of what could have happened to the farmers, but he kept his fears to himself. They needed to focus on finding food, not on the potential dangers lurking in the shadows. The beam of the flashlight fell upon a closed storage room door, and they approached it cautiously. Linda's hand trembled as she pushed it open, revealing shelves laden with jars of preserves and canned goods. They couldn't believe their luck. They quickly filled their backpacks, trying not to take too much. They didn't want to leave the farm as bare as they had found it. As they turned to leave, the sound of a twig snapping outside sent their hearts racing. They doused the light and pressed their bodies against the cold barn wall, listening intently. The footsteps grew closer, and they could make out the murmur of voices in the night. "Hurry," Mark whispered, his eyes darting to the loft above them. They climbed the ladder as quietly as they could, the wood groaning beneath their weight. From their vantage point, they saw a small group of people approaching the barn, flashlights bobbing in the dark. Linda's chest tightened as she recognized some of their neighbors, the same people who had turned to pet food out of desperation. She hoped they hadn't seen them, that they would just pass by and leave them in peace. But the footsteps grew louder, and the voices grew clearer. "I heard something," a man's voice called out. Mark and Linda held their breath, their hearts pounding in unison. The group's flashlights played across the barn's entrance, and they knew they had to move. They crept through the loft, the hay rustling beneath their feet, trying to find a place to hide. The footsteps grew closer, and the voices grew more insistent. "It's gotta be in here," a woman's voice said. Linda and Mark exchanged a panicked look. They had to get out before they were discovered. Mark spotted a trap door in the corner of the loft and gestured for her to follow. They crawled over to it, their hearts thudding like drums in their chests. The trapdoor led to a narrow attic space filled with cobwebs and the faint scent of mold. They pushed it open and slipped inside, pulling it shut behind them. The footsteps grew louder, and the flashlights pierced the cracks in the wood. The group entered the barn below, their shadows playing on the ceiling above. They talked in hushed tones, their desperation palpable. The couple held their breath, their hearts racing in the confined space. They heard the group rummaging through the storage room, their flashlights flickering under the door. "It's gone," someone exclaimed, and the voices grew agitated. "Someone's been here." Linda and Mark shared a horrified look. The group had found their stash, and they knew it was only a matter of time before they were caught. Mark put his finger to his lips, reminding Linda to stay silent. The footsteps grew louder as the group approached the ladder. The first person began to ascend, the wood creaking with each step. Linda's heart felt like it was in her throat, and she could feel Mark's hand shaking beside her. They had no weapons, no way to defend themselves if it came to that. All they could do was hope they wouldn't be discovered. As the footsteps reached the top, the barn fell silent. They could feel the person's eyes scanning the loft, the beam of their flashlight playing across the floorboards. Mark and Linda held their breath, their eyes locked on the narrow sliver of light beneath the door. The silence stretched on, taut as a bowstring. Then, just as Linda thought she couldn't bear it any longer, the footsteps retreated. The group below murmured to each other before finally leaving the barn. They waited, listening to the receding sounds of their neighbors' footsteps and the quiet sobs of relief that filled the space. They waited a good 20 minutes before daring to move, their legs stiff and cramped from being still for so long. Cautiously, they made their way back to the trapdoor, peeking through the crack to ensure the coast was clear. The moon had moved slightly, casting new shadows across the barn. They descended the ladder, the wood groaning in protest beneath them. The storage room was empty, their stolen supplies gone. Linda's eyes filled with tears as they realized the gravity of their mistake. They had taken food from people who were just as desperate as they were. "We can't keep doing this," she whispered, her voice shaky. "We have to find another way." "We will," Mark promised, though the doubt in his voice was unmistakable. They left the barn, the weight of their guilt as heavy as the packs on their backs. The night was still and cold. the only sound the crunch of their footsteps on the gravel path. They walked back towards town, their eyes peeled for any signs of movement. The silence was unsettling, a stark reminder of the desperation that had gripped their once bustling community. The streetlights flickered erratically, casting a sickly glow over the abandoned storefronts. As they approached the supermarket, a distant rumble reached their ears. It grew louder, a cacophony of engines and honking horns. They quickened their pace, hopeful that a convoy of supply trucks had finally arrived. But as they turned the corner, their hearts sank. A line of cars snaked around the block, their headlights piercing the night. People were fighting over the last of the gas at the station across the street, their shadows thrown long and grotesque in the harsh light. The supermarket's doors were barricaded with overturned carts, a makeshift defense against the desperate mob. Linda and Mark exchanged a look of despair. They had been so focused on their own survival that they had forgotten about the chaos that had overtaken their town. The sight of their neighbors fighting over food was a sobering reminder of how quickly things had spiraled out of control. They ducked into the alley beside the supermarket, the sound of shouting and breaking glass echoing through the night. "We can't go back home empty-handed," Linda said, her voice tight with anxiety. "We have to find something." Mark nodded, his jaw set. They had to find a way to survive without resorting to eating pet food or stealing from their neighbors. His mind raced, trying to think of a solution. "What about the park?" he suggested. "There might be some fruit trees or a community garden." Linda's eyes lit up with hope. "That's a good idea," she said, gripping his arm tightly. "Let's go." They slipped through the shadows, avoiding the chaos at the gas station. The park was a few blocks away, a small patch of green in an otherwise concrete jungle. As they approached, they saw a few flickering lights and heard the murmur of voices. It seemed like others had had the same idea. "We have to be careful," Mark whispered, his eyes scanning the area. "We don't know who's out here." Linda nodded, her grip on the flashlight tight. The park was eerily quiet, except for the rustling of leaves and the distant sound of arguing. They moved through the darkness, sticking to the shadows, their eyes peeled for any signs of fruit trees or gardens. As they reached the center of the park, they stumbled upon a small group huddled around a makeshift campfire. The warmth of the flames danced across their faces, and the smell of roasting meat made their stomachs growl. The group looked up, their eyes wary, as Mark and Linda approached. "Hey," Mark called out, his voice low and cautious. "We're just looking for some food. Do you guys have any extra?" The group's leader, a burly man with a beard that had gone untrimmed for weeks, eyed them suspiciously. He held a skewer of sizzling meat over the fire, his hands steady despite the tension in the air. "What's it to you?" he grunted. Linda stepped forward, her voice quivering with hunger. "We're just trying to get by," she said, holding out her empty palms. "The supermarket's cleaned out. We heard there might be something here." The bearded man studied them for a long moment, then nodded towards a small pile of fruit and vegetables beside the fire. "Take what you need, but don't take too much. We're all in this together." The group around the fire watched as Mark and Linda approached, their eyes flickering between the food and the newcomers. They picked through the meager offerings, selecting a few apples, some carrots, and a handful of potatoes. The act of choosing felt almost sacred, as if they were committing a crime against their starving stomachs by not taking more. "Thank you," Linda murmured, her voice tight with gratitude. The bearded man nodded. "We all gotta help each other out. Can't have folks starving in our own town." His words were gruff, but his eyes were kind. They turned to leave, their stomachs feeling a little less empty. As they moved away from the firelight, Mark whispered, "We can't keep relying on the kindness of strangers." Linda nodded, her teeth chattering in the cold. "We need to find a more sustainable solution." They made their way home in the quiet of the early morning, their breaths puffing in the frigid air. The town was a ghost of its former self, the darkness hiding the desperation that had taken root in every corner. As they approached their street, they saw a figure in the distance, silhouetted by the flickering streetlights. It was Old Man Jenkins, standing in front of his house, a shotgun slung over his shoulder. Linda tugged on Mark's arm, fear creeping into her voice. "Do you think he saw us?" Mark squinted into the darkness, trying to read the old man's expression. "I don't know," he murmured. "We should talk to him, explain ourselves." They approached Old Man Jenkins, the gravity of the situation weighing on every step. The old man's eyes narrowed as he recognized them, the barrel of his shotgun dipping slightly. "You two," he rasped. "What do you want?" Mark stepped forward, the bag of stolen food feeling like a weight around his neck. "We're sorry, Mr. Jenkins. We didn't mean to take your supplies. We were just desperate." The old man's gaze softened slightly, the moonlight glinting off his spectacles. "I know the feeling," he said gruffly, "but you can't go around taking what's not yours. It's every man for himself out here now, but that don't mean you gotta go stealing." Linda stepped up beside Mark, her voice shaking with sincerity. "We're sorry. We won't do it again. We're just trying to find a way to survive." Old Man Jenkins studied them for a moment, the weight of their words hanging in the air. Then, with a grunt, he jerked his head towards his house. "You'd better come in," he said. "It's not safe out here. Thank you for your time. God bless."